A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin. First chapter Friday read aloud video with Word Nerd. Today, as you listen, play along. Watch for the story quote that will appear on screen. Write it down, word by word, and then follow the directions given to you by your teacher. Make sure you stay all the way to the end to see that you've written it down correctly. Teachers, check out the description box for these great worksheets. You can print them off and use them in conjunction with these read aloud videos. I have one for every video on my channel. One last thing
Hi,
before we
my
get
name's
started, I want to give a
Welcome to
shout
my
out to
channel,
Mrs.
Learning with the
James's
Word
8th
Nerd, and
graders
another
at Lone
First
Grove
Chapter
Middle
Friday
School
video.
in Lone Grove,
This week I'm going to
Oklahoma.
be reading to
Thanks
you
so much for
from A
being here
Lady's
today,
Guide to
guys. I hope
Fortune
you enjoy
Hunting by
this First
Sophie
Chapter
Irwin,
Friday
and I
read
have to
aloud
tell you
video.
guys, this book was so much fun. If you were a reader who's looking to read about romance, about a historical period in the past where things were very fancy. They went to a lot of balls. They liked architecture and art and just fancy, fancy, fancy. If you like reading about those things and maybe a little bit of matchmaking, you are going to love this book. It was just so stinking fun. Let me read you the inside blurb so you know a little bit more what it's about rather than it's just a fancy story. And then we'll read chapter 1. But I have to tell you, before I share this, the main character is just so funny, and I think that I would be friends with her perhaps if we, lived in real life. I mean, I do if she did, and I lived in the 1800s during the British Regency when the story takes place, but I don't. So it's fun that we get to be friends through the pages of this book. All right, enough rambling. Here is what this story is all about. Kitty Talbot needs a fortune, or rather, she needs a husband who has a fortune. Left with her father's massive debts, she has only 12 weeks to save her family from ruin. Kitty has never been one to back down from a challenge, so she leaves home and heads toward the most dangerous battleground in all of England, the London season. Kitty may be neither accomplished nor especially genteel, but she is absolutely single-minded. Imbued with cunning and ingenuity, she knows that risk is just part of the game. The only thing she doesn't anticipate is Lord Radcliffe. The worldly Radcliffe sees Kitty for the mercenary fortune hunter that she really is, and he's determined to thwart her plans at all costs, until their pairing takes a completely different turn. This is a frothy pleasure full of brilliant repartee and enticing wit, one that readers will completely take delight in. And I can agree. I absolutely did delight in this story. So let us jump in to A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin. Chapter 1 takes place at Netfleet Cottage, Biddington, Dorsetshire, which is in England, 1818. You're not going to marry me? Miss Talbot repeated disbelievingly. Afraid not, Charles Linfield replied, his expression set in a kind of bracingly apologetic grimace, the sort one might wear when confessing you no longer could attend a friend's birthday party, rather than one you would wear when ending a 2-year engagement. Kitty stared at him, uncomprehending. Catherine Talbot, Kitty to her family and closest acquaintances, she was not much used to incomprehension. In fact, she was well known among her family and Biddington at large for her quick mind and her talent for practical problem-solving. Yet in this moment Kitty felt quite at a loss. She and Charles were to be married. She had known it for years, and now it was not to be? What should one say? What should one feel in the face of such news? Everything was changed, and yet Charles looked the same, dressed in clothes she had seen him in 1,000 times before, with that disheveled style only the wealthy could get away with. An intricately embroidered waistcoat that was badly misbuttoned, a garishly bright cravat that had been mangled rather than tied. He ought to at least, Kitty thought, staring at the awful cravat with a rising sense of indignation, to have dressed for the occasion. Some of this ire must have seeped through her expression, because all at once Charles swapped his maddening air of apologetic condescension for that of a sulky schoolboy. "Oh, you needn't look at me like that," he snapped. "It isn't as if we were ever officially promised to one another." Officially promised to one another! Kitty's spirit returned to her in full force, and she discovered, in fact, that she felt quite furious. The irredeemable cad! We've been speaking of marriage for the past 2 years. We were only delayed this long because of my mother's death and my father's sickness. You promised me so many things. Just the talk of children, he protested, before adding mullishly, and besides, it isn't as if I could call things off when your father was on death's door. it wouldn't have been the thing at all. Oh, and I suppose now that he's dead, not a month in the ground, you could finally jilt me? She said wrathfully. Is that so much more the thing? He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flicking to the door. Listen, there's no point in us discussing it when you're like this. He affected the tone of a severely tired man holding on to his patience. Perhaps I should go. Go? You can't possibly drop news such as this and not explain yourself. I saw you just last week, and we were discussing marrying in May, not 3 months away. Perhaps I should have just written a letter, he said to himself, still staring longingly at the door. Mary said this was the best way to do it, but I think a letter would have been simpler. I can't think properly with you shrieking at me. Kitty cast aside her many irritations, and with the instincts of a true hunter, she fixed only on the salient information. Mary? She said sharply. Mary Spencer. What exactly does Miss Spencer have to do with this? I had not realized she had returned to Biddington. Yes. Well, yes, she has. That is, Mr. Linfield stammered, beads of sweat appearing on his brow. My mother invited her to stay with us for a time, and it's been so good for my sisters to make other female acquaintances. And you spoke to Miss Spencer about our engagement and bringing it to an end? Yes, well, she was sympathetic to the situation, to both our situations, and I must say it was good to be able to speak to someone about it. Silence for a moment, and then, almost casually, Mr. Linfield, do you mean to propose to Miss Spencer? No, well, that is to say, we already, so I thought it best to come here. I see, Kitty said, and she did. Well, I suppose I must commend you upon your confidence, Mr. Linfield. It is quite the feat to propose to one woman whilst still being engaged to another. Bravo. Bravo indeed. This is exactly what you always do, Mr. Linfield complained, mustering some courage at last. You twist everything around until I don't know which way is up. Have you thought, perhaps, that I wanted to spare your feelings, that I didn't want to have to tell you the truth, that if I wanted to make a career for myself in politics, I can hardly do it married to someone like you? His derisive tone shocked her. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? She demanded. He spread his arms as if inviting her to look around. Kitty did not. She knew what she would see, for she had stood in this room every day of her life. The worn chaise lounge huddled by the fireplace for warmth, once elegant rug on the hearth now moth-eaten and shabby, shelves where there had once been books now standing empty. We may live in the same town, but we're from different worlds. He waved his hands about again. I'm the son of a squire, and Mamma and Miss Spencer helped me to see that I cannot afford to make a mésalliance if I am to make a name for myself. Kitty had never been so aware of the sound of her heartbeat pounding a drum loudly in her ears. Mésalliance, was she? Mr. Linfield, she said softly but with bite. Let there be no lies between us. You had no issue with our engagement until you encountered pretty Miss Spencer again. A squire's son, you say? This is not the sort of ungentlemanly conduct I would have expected your family to condone. Perhaps I ought to be pleased that you have proven yourself to be so utterly dishonorable before it was too late. She landed each blow with the precision and force of Gentleman Jackson, and Charles, Mr. Linfield, forever now staggered backward from her. How could you say such a thing? He said, aghast. It is not ungentlemanly. You are becoming quite hysterical. Mr. Linfield was sweating thickly now, twisting uncomfortably. I do want us to remain great friends, and you have to understand, Kit, Miss Talbot, she corrected with frigid politeness. A shriek of rage was howling through her body, but she contained it, gesturing sharply to the door with a wave of her hand. You'll forgive me if I ask you to see yourself out, Mr. Linfield. After a quick bob of a bow, he fled eagerly from her without looking back. Kitty stood motionless for a moment, holding her breath as if to prevent this disaster from unfolding any further. Then she walked to the window where the morning sun was streaming in, leaned her forehead against the glass, and exhaled slowly. From this window she had an uninterrupted view of the garden. The daffodils just beginning to flower, the vegetable patch still thick with weeds, and those loose chickens picking their way through looking for grubs. Life outside continued on, and yet on this side of the glass everything was utterly ruined. They were alone. completely and utterly alone now, with no one to turn to. Mamma and Papa were gone, and in this hour of most grievous need, where more than ever she wished to ask for their advice, she could not. There was simply no one left to whom she could turn. Panic was rising within her. What was she going to do now? She might have stayed in this position for several hours were she not interrupted by her youngest sister, 10-year-old Jane, who barged in only a few minutes later with the self-importance of a royal messenger. "Kitty, where is Cecily's book?" she demanded. "It was in the kitchen yesterday," Kitty answered without looking away from the garden. "They ought to weed the artichoke bed this afternoon. It would need planting before long." Distantly she heard Jane call to Cecily to pass on her words. "She's looked there," came the reply. "Well, look again." Kitty dismissed her impatiently with a flap of the hand. The door opened and closed with a bang. "She says it's not there, and if you've sold it, she said she'll be very upset because it was a gift from the vicar." "Oh, for goodness sake," Kitty snapped. "You may tell Ceci that I can't look over her silly vicar book because I've just been jilted and need a few moments' reprieve, if that is not too much to ask." No sooner had Jane relayed this unusual message to Cecily than the full household, all of Kitty's 4 sisters and Bramble the dog, descended upon the parlor, instantly filling the space with noise. "Kitty, what is this about Mr. Linfield jilting you? Has he really? I never liked him. He always patted me on the head as if I were a child. My book is not in the kitchen." Kitty told him as briefly as she could what had happened, with her head still resting on the glass. There was silence after this, as Kitty's sisters stared uncertainly at each other. After a few moments, Jane, having grown bored, wandered over to the creaking pinafort and broke the silence by bashing out a jolly tune. Jane had never received music lessons, but what she lacked in talent she made up for in both fervor and volume. "How awful!" Beatrice, at 19 years, Kitty's closest sister in both age and temperament, said at last, appalled. "Oh, dear Kitty, I am so sorry. You must be heartbroken." Kitty turned her head sharply. "Heartbroken? Beatrice, that is quite beside the point. Without marrying Mr. Linfield, we are all ruined. Mamma and Papa have left us the house, but they have also left us an astonishing amount of debt. I was depending on the Linfield wealth to save us." "You were marrying Mr. Linfield for his fortune?" Cecily asked, a judgmental note in her voice. The intellectual of the family at 18 years of age, Cecily was felt by her sisters to have a rather overdeveloped sense of morality. "Well, it was certainly not for his integrity or gentlemanly honor," Kitty said bitterly. "I just wished it had the sense to wrap it up sooner. We should not have pushed back the wedding when Mamma died. I knew that a long engagement was asking for trouble. To think that Papa thought it would look unseemly." "How bad is it?" Beatrice asked. Kitty stared silently at her for a few moments. How could she tell them? How could she explain all that was about to happen? "It is serious," Kitty said carefully. "Papa remortgaged the house to quite some disreputable people. The sales I made our books, the silverware, some of Mamma's jewels, were enough to keep them at bay for a while, but on the 1st of June they will return. Not 4 months away, and if we do not have enough money or proof that we can start paying them, then we will have to leave? But this is our home." Harriet's lip wobbled. As the second youngest, she yet remained more sensitive than Jane, who had at least stopped playing to sit quietly on the stool watching. Kitty did not have the heart to tell them that it would be worse than just leaving, that the sale of Netley Cottage would barely cover their debts, with nothing left to support them. With nowhere to go and no obvious means of income, the future would be a very dark place. They would have no choice but to split up, of course. She and Beatrice might find some employment in Salisbury or one of the larger towns nearby, perhaps as housemaids or ladies' maids if they were truly lucky. Cecily, well, Kitty could not imagine Cecily being willing or able to work for anyone, but with her education she might try a school. Harriet was so young she would have to do the same. Somewhere that would provide her room and board, and Jane, Mrs. Palmer in town, singularly mean-spirited though she was, had always had a sort of fondness for Jane. She might be persuaded to take her until she was old enough to find employment too. Kitty imagined them all, her sisters separated and cast to the winds. Would they ever be together again as they were now? And what if it was far worse than this already bleak scenario? Visions of each of them alone and hungry and despairing flashed before her eyes. Kitty had not yet wept a tear over Mr. Linfield. He was not worth her tears, but now her throat ached painfully. They had already lost so much. It had been Kitty who had had to explain to them that Mama was not going to get better. Kitty who had broken the news of Papa's passing. How was she now to explain that the worst was yet still to come? She could not find the words. Kitty was not their mother, who could pull reassurances from the air like magic, nor their father, who could always say things that would be all right with a confidence that made you actually believe him. No, Kitty was the family's problem solver, but this was far too great an obstacle for her to overcome alone. She wished desperately that there was someone who might carry this burden with her, a heavy load for the tender age of 20, but there was not. Her sisters' faces stared up at her, so sure even now that she would be able to fix everything, as she always had before, as she always would. For the time despair had passed. She could not be defeated so easily. She swallowed down her tears and set her shoulders. We have more than 4 months till the 1st of June, Kitty said firmly, moving away from the window. That is just enough time, I believe, for us to achieve something quite extraordinary. In a town such as Biddington, I was unable to ensnare a rich fiancé. I was, though he turned out to be a weasel, and there's no reason to believe the exercise cannot be repeated simply enough. I do not think any other rich men live nearby, Beatrice pointed out. Just so, her sister replied cheerfully, eyes unnaturally bright, which is why I must travel to more fruitful ground. Beatrice, consider yourself in charge, for I shall be leaving for London. You guys, if you want to find out what happens next to Kitty and all of her sisters, you have to pick up a copy of this book. You can grab it from your local indie bookstore, your school library, and if you can't find it there, you can always get the Amazon link down in the description box. Thank you so much for joining me for this First Chapter Friday. I hope you love this book and that you will join me again for another Read Aloud video. Please subscribe, like, do all the things. See you again next time. Happy reading!
To continue reading A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin, pick up a copy from your school library, purchase one from your favorite local indie bookstore, or grab it via the link in the description box. Then be sure to check out the rest of the First Chapter Friday playlist. I've got many more novels like this waiting for you. This week's mystery quote says, "One must never begin a game by conceding. Play to win, my dear, always." Thanks so much for visiting my channel, Learning with the Word Nerd. I hope you come back again for more First Chapter Friday videos, brain breaks, and other great content. You can find me at these places online. I'll see you again next time. Happy reading!